This is an essay I wrote some years back. I never published it. It was just something I did to help solidify my thoughts. I called it Revelation Without Upkeep is a Hegelian Dialectic. Or the less pretentious sounding title, Why Roman Catholicism is the Only Version of Christianity That Makes Any Sense. It's a question I've thought about a lot during my life. Why Roman Catholicism? Why do I believe this one particular version of this one particular religion? I was born Catholic, but I've had my worldview flipped upside down multiple times at this point. I'm not afraid to start over from scratch if that's what the truth requires. So why do I stick with this? There is some personal observational data that plays into it, but in terms of objective reasoning, it all comes down to one issue. It's the only one that has a solution to the problem of entropy. But before we get into that, we have to talk about revelation as a concept. Why does revelation matter? Religions that aren't based on some kind of revelation from a transcendent being of vastly superior knowledge boil down to an exercise in the history of ideas, suggestions from your parents on how to live based on their own experiences, often mixed with the lies and superstitions of their day. Merely human ideas cannot tell us where we come from or where we're going, as these are things outside of accessible human experience. Some religions claim to have information obtained from ghosts or spirits, or from humans who experience things beyond normal human perception, but the limitations of such sources render them on roughly the same tier. For example, do they actually understand their experiences? Are they passing on a subjective interpretation? Are these experiences applicable to everyone? Are they even being honest about them in the first place, etc.? While these lessons and traditions handed down from those who came before are sometimes deserving of a degree of reverence, none of them can be deserving of what I would call religious devotion. Unlike in science, where a hypothesis can be verified through experimentation with reproducible results, spiritual and supernatural ideas have no touchstone that will tell us when we've come to a correct answer. So as human experience grows and changes, such ideas should be challenged and tested to try as best we can to confirm whether they still are or ever were right. They can be refined, modified, added to, or subtracted from. But divine revelation, assuming that the deity involved is elevated enough above human experience and or nature to have inscrutable first-hand knowledge of the information being revealed, is reliably honest, and is competent enough to ensure that the persons receiving it will understand it correctly, is not subject to the just human ideas problem. And of course, determining whether or not a deity meets those qualifications is a completely separate topic. But assuming you've decided that, revelation gives you access to absolute truth, and thus is worthy of being treated as sacred and adhered to without question. Knowing supernatural truths with that kind of certainty can be very useful in, for example, forming a worldview or deciding on a manner of living. Likewise, if you've ruled out the existence of such revelation on a mass scale, that also narrows down your possible conclusions significantly. For example, if a deity is involved at all, then it is either not omnipotent, does not consider it important for us to know what's going on, or doesn't care about us at all, etc. The problem is, knowledge is subject to death. With any kind of knowledge, passing it on to the next generation is a challenge. Whether or not said generation will believe in the authenticity of a revelation that they didn't receive firsthand is outside the scope of this essay. We're talking about simply making sure the information stays accessible. Until very recently, your only options were written and oral tradition. For the first century or so, this is reasonably manageable. But when you're trying to keep information alive and intact over a period in the thousands of years, you inevitably run into entropy. Physical entropy is a logistical problem, but one that can be overcome with really good planning, organization, and luck. Paper and ink decay, so anything you write needs to be rewritten every few decades. You could extend that by using stone tablets, but those are much more difficult to produce and propagate. Disasters and war can destroy them, so you need to spread copies as far as possible, and the people who keep them have to either receive new copies when they wear out, which was difficult for large texts before the printing press, or make new copies themselves. Copies are prone to human error, accidental or otherwise, and decentralizing the copying process increases this risk, but a diligent system of error checking can minimize this. Purely oral traditions are nearly impossible to keep from changing over a geographic area that takes years to circuit. People misremember, reword, embellish, etc. You know, the telephone game. A centralized system of error correction, for example, a group of credentialed preachers, can catch these as they come up, but history shows that it'll be a messy process even if you have a written component to go along with the oral tradition. But the real problem on this timescale is entropy of meaning. If your written or oral source is at all vague, then this is an enormous problem. But even if it isn't, misunderstanding will still be caused by changes in language, culture, human experience, and a loss of the original context. You may even run into malice or psychosis, people intentionally muddying the interpretation of the source for personal reasons, consciously or unconsciously. As entropy causes disagreements to arise, each will be resolved in one of two ways. A schism, yielding competing and even opposite understandings of the same revelation, or a Hegelian dialectic, which is a fancy term we've been throwing around in the alt-media circles for like 20 years now. In short, it's the process of taking an idea that has become, or always was, abstract or unclear, and making it more concrete through logical discourse. It's sometimes described as thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or problem-reaction-solution. The end result is that it yields a single understanding of the revelation that may or may not be correct. It should also be noted that this process is extremely open to manipulation through rhetoric and bias, and once this door is opened, the understanding can be shifted every generation or so to conform with the new cultural sensibilities. Once entropy has reached this point, the whole thing has effectively transformed into a human idea. With no certain way of knowing what the source originally meant, it no longer gives you access to absolute truth. The revelation, inasmuch as it was something deserving of religious devotion, is lost, and, barring time travel or necromancy, there's only one way to get it back. The deity has to reveal it again. Now, coming to Christianity specifically, both forms of entropy have indeed occurred. Entropy of the oral tradition began pretty much immediately after Jesus left. The epistles record several instances where a community needed to be rebuked because what they were professing had strayed from the gospel they'd been taught, or to be warned against the preaching of false apostles. Examples: Romans 16, 2 Corinthians 11, Galatians 1. Eventually they realized that Jesus wasn't coming back as quickly as they'd first thought, and started getting better about writing things down and saving letters, so the next generation would have a record they could use to rebuke the false apostles that continued appearing, and have continued appearing pretty much non-stop to this day, spreading all manner of heresies. While the scriptures have been astonishingly well preserved, miraculously so really, they are still not perfectly preserved. We have many versions of them in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and Chaldaic, and all of them have minor differences. This has been a problem going all the way back to at least 380 AD, when St. Jerome put the Vulgate together, and some of the Hebrew sources he used don't even exist anymore. Look up the Hexapla and the Tanakh if you want to start down that rabbit hole. Moreover, the apostles didn't leave us with a list of which scriptures are actually from God. Why not the 3 books of Enoch, or the Gospel of Thomas, or the Proto-Evangelium of James? And, obviously, the interpretation of both the scriptures and the writings of the fathers have been heavily debated for a long time. On top of the malice of various groups seeking to use Christ's name to promote their own ideas, the pathology of people who rationalize scripture in a way that suits their own desires, and the changes in culture and context, it must also be acknowledged that neither source was ever specific enough to exclude other interpretations. This is evinced by the fact that there are 5 classifications of Eastern churches and about 200 major Protestant denominations, 47,000 if you count minor variations or independent and non-denominational churches. And that was back when I wrote this essay. There have probably been a few thousand more in the interim. All of these consist largely of sincere and pious people. Most of them believe they received some kind of guidance from the Holy Spirit. Most of them want to follow Jesus. But all of them have different ways of understanding the same revelation he left behind. So, how can we explain this? Because when assessing the validity of any claimed revelation, it is necessary to consider this aspect. Among non-Christian religions, it may be possible to reconcile this entropy with the motives, goals, and limitations of a given deity. For example, if the revelation only needed to be known in a particular time and place to accomplish the deity's purposes, then it is reasonable for it to decay afterwards. Or, if the deity is not all-knowing or is incompetent, then it may not have realized how serious of a problem the decay would be, or have simply been unable to prevent it. Such explanations do not work for Christianity, however. I acknowledge that there is a very, very wide range of beliefs that people put under the umbrella of Christianity, but I think there are 3 basic things that anybody who is professing anything that's even remotely scripturally based can agree on. First, God is all-knowing. Therefore, he knew that this entropy would happen. Second, God is all-powerful. Therefore, he could have either prevented it from happening or made it happen differently. And lastly, the entire premise of Christianity is that God sent Jesus to save us. Most would say as many of us as possible, and that he cares a lot about accomplishing this goal. From that foundation, there are some conclusions we can draw. First, if it was necessary for our salvation that we have a perfect copy of the original scriptures, then we would. That would be easy for God to do. In fact, Jesus could have preempted at least one of these issues by leaving the apostles with a list of which Hebrew scriptures were divinely inspired. So the inescapable conclusion, then, is that God doesn't care if the Bible is perfectly preserved. What we have, and have had during any given generation, which was pretty messy early on, is good enough as far as our salvation is concerned. Second, if it was necessary for our salvation that the scriptures and the writings of the fathers be specific enough that any sincere and pious seeker of truth could read them and come away with a clear and unambiguous understanding of what the basic requirements for salvation are, he would have made them that way. Therefore, one of these three things is true. Option 1. A correct understanding is not necessary for salvation, either because all are saved regardless of what they believe and how they live, or because any attempted interpretation undertaken with good intentions will be honored, i.e. you will be judged according to your own conscience, or because unknown sins can be readily cleansed at the moment of death, or something along those lines. Option 2. The parts that outline the bare requirements for salvation are understandable with a plain sense reading, regardless of translation, culture, and context. It must be a plain sense reading because any other method would require selecting one among many interpretations, and again, we have no criteria for doing that. Additionally, this would require that either all of the major translations are good enough, and it doesn't matter if you include the disputed books of Scripture or not, or that God provided us with some way of knowing which translations are good enough. Or, Option 3. God provided us with some way of getting the correct interpretation, of, in effect, forcing him to repeat the revelation. Beginning from the top of this list, Sola Fide does not solve this. All of the possibilities listed under Option 1 suffer from two problems. First, there is no evidence that anybody in the first millennium believed anything like this. So such beliefs require that God is an incompetent teacher, which is obviously at odds with him being omnipotent and omniscient. Second, while this position successfully evades the objection that salvation was lost with the revelation, it does so by abandoning all of the source material in which belief in Jesus Christ was based in the first place. If the scriptures have become, or always were, indecipherable, and the oral traditions have diverged wildly and become impossible to objectively validate, then on what basis do we believe that Christ rose from the dead, or that he's the Son of God? It intrinsically admits that the revelation is lost, and therefore it is no longer a religion based in revelation. At this point, you would effectively be making a new religion that draws from what is presumed to have been the revelation of Christ. This option still leaves us with merely human ideas. Sola Scriptura cannot be reconciled with this. Without even getting into translation issues, Option 2 can be objectively ruled out. Covering the disputes that surround the writings of the Fathers would be a sizable undertaking. A study of the issues dividing the various forms of Orthodoxy and Catholicism should make the point, so I will limit myself to the Bible. And this is where everyone is going to want to argue with me, which is funny because the very fact that we can have a sincere argument about this makes my point for me. But just for the sake of completion, here are 3 points on the requirements for salvation that are sufficiently debatable. I'll put the original text of the essay on screen if you want to read it all, but I'm going to skim through this kind of quickly. One of the biggest modern debates is over how much of the Mosaic law is still applicable under the law of Christ. Acts is very explicit that both circumcision and most of the dietary laws are no longer in effect, so there were at least some changes. I could bring up Matthew 5, where Jesus says, "Not one jot or tittle shall pass from the law until heaven and earth pass away," which adds some confusion, but we'll just ignore that. There's Matthew 19, where he's asked explicitly, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And he gives several commandments from the Decalogue and adds, "Love thy neighbor as thyself." So you could interpret that as all 10 commandments are required for salvation. That was before the resurrection, though, so you could argue that he was talking about the old law. But if you cross-reference 1 Corinthians, that gives a similar list of items from the Decalogue. Fornicators, idolaters, thieves, covetous, etc. will not possess the kingdom. That's after the resurrection, so that's definitely talking about the new law. But it also adds drunkards, railers, and extortioners, which are not explicitly named in the Decalogue. You could interpret those as being included in some of the commandments, but again, we're looking for a plain sense reading here. So apparently it isn't just the Decalogue. What else from the old law is still required? There's no firm answer to that question. But even if we assume it is just the 10 commandments, that still leaves considerable room for interpretation. For example, does false witness include all lying, or literally just false testimony in a court? What about lying under duress, such as during a hostage situation? Does it count as theft if you illegally recover equity from a thief in a society where law enforcement is corrupt? Matthew 5 says you're not supposed to do this, but it's unclear if it's a requirement or just a suggestion. How about the Sabbath? Even in Jesus' time, the Jews had several schools of thought regarding what you could and couldn't do on the Sabbath, and what kind of honor was due to parents. And while Jesus condemned the extreme and hypocritical positions of the Pharisees, he never spelled out what the correct way to observe these commandments was, as far as we know. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, is very open to interpretation. How about this one? You have heard that it was said to them of old, Thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say to you, that whosoever shall look on a woman to lust after her, hath already committed adultery with her in his heart. This could be taken as a clarification of part of the 10th commandment, or just the 7th. But what exactly is being forbidden here? The action mentioned is looking, but the essence of the sin is committed in the heart. Does that mean it applies to lustful thoughts standing alone, or is the looking component necessary? Does it only apply to adultery? In other words, one of the people involved is married. Or does the same principle extend to fornication? Does it only apply to real women? What about pictures? How realistic would the pictures have to be? Do furries count? It also doesn't say that this applies to women looking at men. That's an obvious assumption to make, because the commandment against adultery does apply to women, but you can't prove it because it's not explicitly in the text. It might sound like I'm being pedantic, but these are the kinds of questions that come up over the course of centuries. And yes, you can use cross-references to come up with answers for some of these sorts of questions that don't violate the law of non-contradiction, but not all, and whether or not something is applicable as a cross-reference is often debatable. Okay, one more example to drive it home. The parable of the sheep and the goats. The goats go to hell because they didn't feed the hungry, clothe the naked, or visit the imprisoned. Is that a positive requirement or a negative requirement? That is, are we condemned for not seeking out the least and aiding them, or merely for failing to aid those we encounter? If positive, then to what extent must we go out of our way? If a cross-reference with Matthew 7 or Matthew 19 is applicable, that may suggest that it's a higher requirement than anyone would normally meet, which would make it an even more serious question. Let's move on to the second item, forgiveness of sins. A central part of the gospel message, obviously an important mechanic in obtaining salvation. If there's a precise and easy method of obtaining forgiveness, then a clear path to heaven would still be available, even without a firm understanding of what is and isn't a sin. James 5 and John 20 attribute this power to other people. Whose sins you shall forgive, they are forgiven them. Whose sins you shall retain, they are retained. What's most significant here is that they're not only given the power to forgive, but to prevent forgiveness. The very existence of such a power appears to be at odds with the command to forgive all offenses, which is a requirement for obtaining forgiveness yourself. Matthew 6, if you will not forgive men, neither will your Father forgive you. It's unclear if this power is given to everyone who receives the Holy Ghost, to just the apostles, or to some kind of priest class, the structure of which the book never explicitly defines. Giving the ability to prevent forgiveness to everyone would seem like utter chaos, but this could be taken as a justification for Matthew 5:25, make peace with your adversary on the way, before you get to the judge. There's 1 Peter 4, which says that charity covers a multitude of sins, which is extremely vague. There's Acts 8, where he exhorts somebody to do penance and pray to God to obtain forgiveness, which could be an example of him as an apostle granting forgiveness, or of an individual obtaining it for himself through prayer. Then there's 1 John, where he exhorts the confession of sins in order to obtain forgiveness. But that could be taken as a requirement to confess to a certain group of people, or simply to admit to oneself one's own sinfulness generally. There are also passages that suggest baptism cleanses sins, but there are no examples of a person being baptized more than once. Overall, this does not yield a clear understanding of how forgiveness works. And then, of course, there's John 5. Amen, amen, I say unto you, except you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you shall not have life in you. He that eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood hath everlasting life, and I will raise him up in the last day. What does that mean? It's clearly put forward as a requirement for obtaining eternal life, so we had better be able to make sense of it. Obviously, the Last Supper calls back to this line, but doesn't provide any explicit details. 1 Corinthians 10 and 11 appear to reference it, and suggest that some kind of ceremony involving bread and wine was in use, but what it was and what it meant are never explained. It's assumed that the readers are already familiar with it. Today, there are many interpretations of this, and many different rituals claiming to satisfy this requirement. Separated by thousands of years, how can we determine which ones are valid without knowing what the essence of it was? It's ludicrous to believe that Jesus expected us to wrestle with his instructions like this. If he really intended the Bible to serve as a standalone guide of what we need to do and not do in order to avoid his own wrathful judgment, then it would have been clear and detailed enough that any well-meaning and literate person would come away from it knowing exactly that. And if he expected us to include other early Christian sources in our reading, ignoring the problem of determining which ones are authentic and accurate, that would narrow down the possible interpretations significantly, but still not enough to yield a clear path to salvation. I mean, picture this from the perspective of somebody who's new to Christianity and is looking to get started. Which of the 200 organized denominations or thousands upon thousands of private practices do you pick? What kind of guide can you have but your own subjective sensibilities? And just going with whatever one sounds right to you and expecting it to actually be the truth would be arrogance or naivete unto folly. It shouldn't take you long in this world to figure out that that's not how things work. Even if you wanted to make the argument that it's possible to reliably arrive at a correct interpretation through some process of logical deduction and study, that would effectively mean that anyone who isn't smart enough to successfully discover and use that process, or to put their trust in somebody who is doomed. And Jesus never said anything about needing to be smart to get into heaven. If anything, you could argue that he implied the opposite in Luke 10:21. Likewise, anyone contending that the Spirit guides them to the truth must explain why the other 46,999 groups of equally devout and prayerful believers are not granted the same favor. And there are groups who claim to be unique in that regard. They fall under option 3. And this is where we come back to my thesis. Simply put, just as no human creation can survive forever without continuous upkeep, divine revelation cannot survive without continuous divine intervention. Option 1 forfeited the revelation. Option 2 proposed that the divine preservation of the text was enough to preserve the meaning, but as I outlined, it was not. Option 3 is that God left us some kind of divine mechanism to obtain the correct answers to any questions that could possibly arise as a result of entropy. And most of you know where this is going. While it is likely that some fringe groups have claimed an oracular ability to interpret the word of Christ, or to speak for him directly, it is equally likely that their credibility is such that they aren't worth mentioning. There are only 2 notable Christian groups that have ever claimed an ability to unfailingly summon doctrinal answers from God: Catholics and Orthodox. And only one of the 2 claims to have one that's even potentially functional. The Orthodox think they have infallible dogma, but they really don't. Like Roman Catholics, they believe that the theological decrees of ecumenical councils are infallible, but they can't come up with a definition of what makes a council valid or invalid. The Eastern Orthodox churches all claim that at least 7 councils were valid, but some of them also consider the 4th and 5th councils of Constantinople valid, or the Council of Trullo, and there was a recent one in 2016 that might be accepted, and nobody can come up with a sound reason why their listed councils were infallible while the rest were not. It's not the percentage of bishops in attendance, because some of the rejected councils had more than some of the 7 main ones, and it's not that there was unanimous agreement on what was decreed, or even general acceptance by the faithful, because Chalcedon is one of the 7 main councils, but it was so divisive that the bishops of Syria and Egypt left to form the Oriental Orthodox, which only accept the first 3 councils. And that doesn't even get into the problem of interpreting the decrees of a council over 1,000 years old. For example, Roman Catholics take some of the wording used at Chalcedon as evidence of papal primacy in jurisdiction, whereas the Orthodox interpret it as simply a primacy in love. How do you decide which interpretation is right? The Orthodox could hold another council to answer the question, but how could they prove that council was valid if only the main 3 or 7 can be agreed upon? In short, they have a fallible list of infallible councils, with texts whose meaning is subject to decay. In effect, they have neither infallibility nor any other authoritative way to settle the doctrinal disputes that have divided them. Like every other religion that starts out based in alleged revelation, but possesses no divine means of combating entropy, they are left with human approximations of what they started with, rightly questioned, subject to change, and with no certainty that they bear resemblance to the original revelation they emerged from. No promise of truth. The Roman solution is simple. The Pope is infallible. By making an ex cathedra statement or ratifying an ecumenical council, he effectively commands God to repeat whatever portion of revelation is in question. This is not a perfect solution in that, while it makes it possible to repair the damage caused by entropy over time, it doesn't prevent it from occurring altogether. And in the time that it takes for an issue to rise to a pope's attention and get addressed, there will be periods of confusion, both widespread and localized. And even outside of such periods, an individual or a region can be subject to bad instruction from members of the church's hierarchy, whether from malice or incompetence. But while that does inevitably result in turmoil, the religion accounts for such situations in its teaching that the virtue of obedience covers sins of ignorance. That is, one bears no culpability for sins that arise from what one has been led to believe by an authoritative source is the teaching of the Church. So these logistical problems do not inhibit salvation, as one's personal intelligence and discernment are not factors. After one has already come to the decision to embrace the religion, obviously. There are times when an educated individual with a well-formed conscience, having worked with the people in their chain of authority in a spirit of humility and using the writings of the Fathers as their basis, confidently believe that what they're being told is not in fact the teaching of the Church, can, or even must, disobey such teaching until infallibility steps in and settles the matter, as was exemplified by St. Athanasius during the Arian crisis. But in cases where any uncertainty exists, one must err on the side of obedience, as human frailty makes it easy to have too much confidence in one's own analysis. It's a safety net similar to the proposals under option A, but because the Pope eventually invokes God to restore the revelation in full clarity, it never suffers from serious entropic decay, and thus the inadequacies of option A do not apply. And whether or not you believe that God answers the Pope, it is fact that the Roman Catholic Church is the only significant Christian group that even claims to have access to absolute truth and an effective means of preserving it. Either they are right, or the revelation of Jesus Christ has been lost, and with it reliable access to the salvation he preached. Such loss is incompatible with Christianity's central proclamation of good news, and would leave the religion soundly discredited. God could have sent an angel every generation or so to clear up any confusion that had arisen about who Christ was and what he taught. He could have sent a prophet like Elijah, or a judge like Samuel, calling down fire and raising the dead to settle these questions. He could have given us something like the Urim and the Thummim that the Jewish high priests used to divine answers. But he didn't. Instead, he gave us the apostles and their successors, and in particular, one guy who has the power to make declarative statements about faith and morals with a guarantee that they'll never be wrong. Either Christ was a fraud, or the Roman Catholic Church is the one true church established by him, against which the gates of hell shall not prevail. There is no other coherent option. And that's how I see it. I don't see any way around this issue. But how do you know who the Pope is? In my original essay, I didn't address this. It's actually a pretty complicated question, and I decided it was out of scope. But it does have to be addressed, because if it's not possible to objectively determine who the Pope is, then you end up with a fallible list of infallible popes, and that would put the Romans in exactly the same position as the Orthodox. So let's consider the rest of this an extended footnote on the mechanics of papal succession. And the reason it's so extended is because this matter is not as well codified as it should be, given its importance. There's actually quite a few things that I think are not as well codified as they should be. For example, there's not even an official list of ex cathedra definitions. The closest we have is the Enchiridion Symbolorum, which was first compiled in 1854 by a priest as an independent project. And on the one hand, it speaks to the honesty of the clergy that they've never just made up rules for how this works, because clearly neither Jesus nor the apostles left such instructions. On the other hand, this is exactly the kind of thing that infallibility is meant to solve. Defining rules and widely propagating them could have prevented several anti-popes from gaining support and spared a lot of people a lot of strife. Though so far, none of these have resulted in a doctrinal dispute, since none of the parties involved have attempted to issue ex cathedra declarations during the period when their authenticity was in question, and the situations have always been resolved relatively quickly. The longest was the Great Western Schism, which went on for 40 years. Most pressing to our current day, it has not been determined whether or not it is possible for a pope to involuntarily lose the papacy, but despite this lack of formally defined mechanics, I believe that logical deduction can provide sufficient answers at this point. First, I should note that it is possible to bypass most potential problems with this system by supposing that, in any situation where it's unclear who the true pope is, God effectively grants infallibility to all known candidates, preventing them from defining false doctrine under the appearance of ex cathedra even intentionally. History has not yet furnished us with an example contradicting this, so it is possible, but this is not a codified part of the Church's dogma, and we have no particular reason to believe it's true, so I will proceed under the assumption that it is not. There are two questions we have to address: how a man becomes pope, and under what conditions he can cease to be pope. And there are three rules I've come up with that must be true in order for this system to function as an effective means of combating entropy. It cannot happen secretly, it cannot happen subjectively, and it cannot happen retroactively. The Pope is, firstly, the Bishop of the See of Rome, and is chosen the same way as any other bishop. The local clergy pick someone, and he accepts the appointment. The exact method by which they've chosen him has changed over the centuries, and the intended process has not always been followed. There have been cases like Pelagius I, where popes were appointed by the secular government with no election taking place, and even instances like Pope Christopher, who threw his predecessor Leo V into prison and took the papacy by force. It was originally believed that Leo died shortly thereafter, at which point Christopher, having the assent of the Roman clergy, became the legitimate pope. But recent study suggests Leo lived throughout Christopher's reign, resulting in his reclassification as an anti-pope. However, Pope Sergius III did exactly the same thing to Christopher 4 months later, and either killed both him and Leo V or they died in prison. Some accounts say Christopher was allowed to retire to a monastery. And he's still regarded as a legitimate pope. It is evident, therefore, that the method of selection is not an essential component to how one becomes pope. The sole common element has been the acknowledgement of the clergy. Once a candidate is agreed upon and has accepted, he immediately receives the charism of infallibility. And I can't find sufficient examples to determine if a certain percentage of the clergy must accept him, or if they must deliberate until there's no firm objection. It doesn't seem to have come up in any of the anti-pope situations that I've found documented. Given this, it is obviously impossible for a person to become pope without at least the Roman clergy knowing about it. But it is likewise impossible for a papal election to be secretly invalid. If a valid pope cannot be objectively distinguished from an invalid one, then infallible statements cannot be distinguished from fallible ones, and the entire concept of papal infallibility becomes useless. Therefore, a pope's validity cannot depend on any potentially secret factor. For example, a fraudulent election does not invalidate a papacy. If it did, and if the fraud was never discovered, then a false pope could make false statements under the color of infallibility, and we would never know, negating the purpose of the charism. As I mentioned, the method by which the clergy arrive at their choice is irrelevant so long as they all acknowledge a single candidate and he accepts the position. They could hold a Super Smash Bros. Tournament, no items, box only, final destination, and the winner could cheat and still be the true pope as long as everyone agreed to it at the end of the day. That would be ridiculous, but it would be valid. Another example, a pope cannot publicly resign and secretly keep the papacy, as some groups theorized that Benedict XVI did. Likewise, a pope cannot secretly abdicate the papacy, thus losing infallibility, while outwardly professing to continue holding the office. Now, this one's going to sound crazy. Hear me out. A pope does not need to be validly baptized or ordained, as baptismal status, and thus priestly status, cannot be objectively confirmed. The paperwork is notoriously spotty and trivially faked. If a man that was invalidly baptized were elected, either God would repair any defect in his sacraments, rendering him a valid bishop, or the papacy is not a sacrament, so even someone who is not actually a bishop can possess the charism of infallibility. Though, of course, any sacraments he administered would not be valid, absent extraordinary divine action. This has an analog in the fact that a non-bishop that is elected is regarded as possessing full jurisdiction from the moment of his election, even prior to being consecrated as a bishop. If one can possess the earthly key of jurisdictional authority without sacramentally being a bishop, it follows that it is at least possible that one could also possess the heavenly key of infallible teaching authority. This is not a hypothetical scenario. A priest from the Archdiocese of Detroit recently discovered that his ordination was invalid because his baptism was invalid because the baptizing priest intentionally changed one word of the formula. And that means that all of the sacraments that he gave out were invalid because he was not actually a priest. And this is not the first time something like that has happened. Now, I'm not here to talk about why that is theologically possible. It only affected a limited number of people, and honestly, I think God repaired the defective sacraments at some point in that chain because those receiving them were well-intentioned and ignorant of the defect. But such a possibility in the papacy would defeat the purpose of infallibility, and therefore it cannot be allowed in the system. Yes, this is a wild edge case, but exploring the edges is how you build a comprehensive understanding of how something works. Here's another one a lot of you are not going to like. A pope does not need to be a sincere Catholic or even believe in God, as interior beliefs cannot be verified. Allowing such to invalidate a papacy leaves nothing objective to rebuke a group claiming, for example, that Pius IX was secretly a Satanist and therefore the First Vatican Council was invalid. This is not hypothetical either. There are sedevacantist groups that claim several of the popes during the last century were secretly Freemasons, and some go as far back as Pius IX. In fact, I think every one of these points so far has been a real argument that somebody has made to try to dismiss one papacy or another. The only appointment that could be considered invalid on its face would be an overt female. However, if a woman somehow managed to climb the episcopal ladder and reigned as pope without ever being detected, that would have to be considered valid because we might never know about it. And even if supposed proof surfaced later, this could not be used to invalidate any ex-cathedra statements during that papacy. Now, an alternative system is possible. If you believe that, as part of the promise of infallibility, God would always make known any secret situation that would invalidate a papacy in a timely manner, such that the Church could correct any doctrinal confusion quickly, then the existence of such invalidating factors within the system would not significantly hinder the purpose of infallibility. The revelation of such secrets would naturally have to be validated by someone in the Church with infallible judgment, most likely a future pope. But your belief could include that a council of bishops convened for this purpose would be given infallible judgment in this particular matter. However, no such belief has been codified, or as far as I know, even conceived, by the Church. And given some of the Church's long-running deliberations on who exactly was pope during certain periods of confusion, the existence of such a guarantee of divine intervention bringing these secrets to light seems doubtful. In either case, the principle stands. A papacy cannot be considered invalidated by something secret. Now, what about the stuff that isn't secret? Beliefs publicly professed prior to a pope's election cannot invalidate their papacy, as you cannot conclusively prove he still held those beliefs at the time of his election. Many theologians, both ancient and modern, have discussed the theoretical possibility that a pope publicly and obstinately professing heresy or outright apostatizing during his reign could have the papacy stripped from him by God. The Church has never officially codified anything regarding this, however. The only confirmed ways for a pope to cease being pope are by dying or willingly resigning. But even if it had been codified, it should be obvious that the practice of individuals subjectively deciding that current or former pontiffs were invalid is not compatible with belief in a functional papal infallibility, since fallible individuals could only produce a fallible list of popes. Even something seemingly objective like a public renunciation of the Catholic faith by a pope could not be independently acted on, since no individual can adequately validate that what they heard was actually said by the pope with full freedom and in a sound state of mind, especially in the current environment of fraudulent news reporting, deepfakes, and AI voice replication. Just as the Church uses infallibility to settle doctrinal disputes, so must it use infallibility to address any question of a pope's validity. It has been suggested that this could take the form of an ecumenical council, where the bishops collectively rule that the current pontiff has lost the papacy and depose him. But the validity of such a council's conclusions could not be objectively proven without an infallible figure to endorse them. And if things got to that point, there would almost certainly be significant dissent no matter what they decided. I think the only way it could be established that a pope whose validity was uncontested at the time they were elected had either never truly been pope or had lost the papacy at some point during their reign would be for a future pope to issue a ruling on it ex cathedra. And if you believe that God has given the Church infallibility for the preservation of his revelation, then you must also believe that God would not allow such a situation to pass into history without the truth being known. And this is where we come to my third rule. A papacy cannot be stricken from the record centuries later, because that would enable a current pontiff to effectively rewrite existing dogma by using some invented pretense to invalidate the earlier popes who defined it. And if the old dogma, which was said to be infallible for centuries, was actually wrong, then it was never infallible, and there'd be no reason to believe the new one was either. That would be a Hegelian dialectic with extra steps, and it would render the entire Catholic religion a farce just as surely as a pope making an ex cathedra definition that contradicts an existing one would. Even if this was done to a papacy during which ex cathedra was never invoked, it would still leave every future generation wondering if there were other such invalid papacies that hadn't been identified yet, or if they were currently living through one, permanently undermining any reasonable faith in the Church's teaching. You cannot make retroactive changes to papal status any more than you can make retroactive changes to infallible dogma, because the two are functionally the same thing. If it is possible for a previous pope to be declared invalid at all, then that declaration would have to be made within a short period of time to have any hope of being legitimate. Francis could not say that Pius IX lost the papacy, and therefore the dogma of the Immaculate Conception was never defined. In the same way, a hypothetical future pope could not declare that, for example, every pope since Vatican II was invalid regardless of justification. Even if they were to appear on live TV with an angel standing beside them working signs and wonders, both examples would still be equally illegitimate. The only case where a relatively long period could theoretically pass without an invalid papacy being officially recognized would be at the end of the world, at which point the long-term preservation of revelation would no longer be a consideration. And even then, it's untenable to believe that God would allow a false pope to declare false doctrine that was, by all appearances, covered by his promise of infallibility if it were done in a way that would hinder anyone's salvation. I can't meaningfully infer how long a papacy's validity might be subject to revision, if it is in fact possible at all. But personally, I would find any attempt to retroactively undo all or part of a papacy by anyone other than his immediate successor to be suspect. Or if circumstances prevented him from doing it, then the next pope who was reasonably able to address it. Not willing, able. And even that seems doubtful to me, because it would effectively mean that we couldn't have confidence in any ex cathedra definition until the pope after the one who made it had left the office. Hindering the effectiveness of infallibility by allowing such a possibility would appear to be at odds with the purpose of giving the Church an infallible authority in the first place. Never mind the possibility of an invalid pope defining false doctrine, then a second pope who's valid declares the first pope invalid, then a third pope who's invalid and thus lacking infallibility invalidly declares the second pope invalid, invalidly invalidating his invalidation of the first pope. Then a fourth pope, who is valid, invalidates the third pope, validly invalidating the third pope's invalid invalidation of the second pope's valid invalidation of the first pope. By the way, that isn't an entirely hypothetical scenario either. Pope Formosius, after a 15-day intermission by Boniface VI, was succeeded by Stephen VI, who, less than a year after his death, decreed Formosius's papacy invalid and annulled all of his acts. The next three popes, Romanus Theodore II and John IX, all agreed that Formosius's papacy was valid, and reinstated his acts, but did not contend that Stephen VI was an invalid pope. Then, after another three popes, Benedict IV, Leo V, and Christopher, Pope Sergius III again declared Formosius invalid, and again this declaration was later found to be illegitimate. Only two interpretations of these events yield a viable model of infallibility. Either these edicts from Stephen VI and Sergius III were both defective in some way that has never been defined. For example, maybe they didn't follow a certain required formula, or they had to be done at a full ecumenical council rather than at a synod, which is where they were both done, which seems highly doubtful given the way that infallibility works in all other circumstances. Or, it is simply not possible to retroactively nullify a papacy under any circumstances. A pope whose election is contemporaneously uncontested remains pope until he dies or resigns no matter what he says or does. And therefore any ruling to the contrary by a future pope is not covered by infallibility because its accuracy is never in question. It's always wrong. While the Church has altered its annuario pontifico over the years to redefine who exactly was pope at what time, this has only been to address anti-pope situations where the true pope's identity was in question from the beginning. The previously referenced example of Pope Christopher might be the one exception to this. He was considered pope from 903 until the 1900s. I can't find exactly when. He was still listed as pope in the 1928 Annuario Pontifico. The 1908 Catholic Encyclopedia mentions that some held him as an anti-pope, but not why or how old that opinion was. If there was always doubt about his status, then this is no different than the other anti-pope examples. And given the circumstances, that would not be surprising. If not, then I would consider erasing a papacy that was recorded as valid for over 1,000 years on the grounds of supposed new historical discoveries to be illegitimate. In either case, I'm not aware that this change was directly sanctioned by a pope or council. The Annuario Pontifico is compiled by the Central Office of Church Statistics, which is run by the Vatican Secretariat of State, so this is not an authoritative change. And there it is, my analysis of the range of possible ways in which the papacy must function in order for infallibility to actually work. But if you might indulge me in concluding with a little editorial comment, the sedevacantist position has been proposed with many different arguments and rationales over the last few decades, but its genesis, the motivation behind it, has always been the same, that God would not let it get this bad, that he would not allow a valid council to issue such bad texts, or a pope to preach heresy from the pulpit, or to encourage his flock to commit grave sin in magisterial documents. Indeed, saints and theologians have expressed that same belief across the Church's history. But the idea that God would allow an impostor to do that, with all of the seeming authority of his vicar on earth, is at least as bad. And while coming up with reasons why one or a handful of popes don't count sounds like an easy answer, closer consideration will make clear that allowing for such possibility would destroy the foundations of the religion. It's a self-defeating solution to a problem that isn't ours to solve. While the disgusting state of the hierarchy is embarrassing and distressing, the Church was not designed with any political means of redress against corruption in its highest office. In short, chill out, guys. Don't promote self-destructive ideas for the sake of optics. It's God's church, and he will fix it. If he doesn't, then it's not his church, and it never was. So, having thoroughly alienated pretty much my entire audience with this video, I think I'll stop here. I may not engage much with the comments on this one. I do always read them, though. God bless.